In the spring of 2004, a woman named Polly Fry made a request that, by any reasonable measure, required considerable nerve. She was 44 years old, an interior designer based in London, and she had spent her entire life as the daughter of Jeremy Fry, an eccentric, brilliant Bath-based inventor and millionaire who had been one of Antony Armstrong-Jones's closest friends for decades. The request wasn't to Jeremy. It was to Armstrong-Jones himself, who by 2004 was 74 years old, the first Earl of Snowdon, former husband of Princess Margaret, a photographer whose portraits of Marlene Dietrich, J.R.R. Tolkien, Iris Murdoch, and David Bowie hung in the permanent collection of the National Portrait Gallery. She asked him to take a DNA test. He agreed. The result was unambiguous. Jeremy Fry wasn't Polly's biological father. Antony Armstrong-Jones was. Armstrong-Jones then told the press no DNA test had taken place. Jeremy Fry, 80 years old, living in a Raja's palace he had dismantled in Kerala, trucked across a mountain range, and rebuilt in Tamil Nadu. Because Jeremy Fry was precisely that kind of man, called the story utter nonsense. Both positions held, publicly, for a while. Then, approximately in 2008, 4 years after the test and 3 years after Jeremy Fry's death, Armstrong-Jones admitted it was true. The date that gives this story its particular shape is 28th May 1960. That is when Polly was born, registered as the daughter of Jeremy and Camilla Fry, his wife. She arrived 22 days after Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones were married at Westminster Abbey on 6th May 1960, in the first royal wedding ever broadcast on television, watched by an estimated 300 million people. She arrived while her biological father was sailing the Caribbean aboard HMY Britannia on the royal honeymoon that would last 43 days and returned to Portsmouth on the 21st of June. A newsreel caption from that day reads, "Margaret back from honeymoon." Returning from 43-day Caribbean cruise, Princess and her husband, Antony Armstrong-Jones, are warmly greeted in Portsmouth, England. Both are tanned and smiling. Tanned and smiling. 24 days after his biological daughter had been born in England under someone else's name. This isn't a story about what happened on a royal yacht. It's a story about what had happened approximately 9 months before the wedding and what kept happening, in silence, for 44 years. To understand the concealment, you need to understand the world that made it possible. In the late 1950s, Antony Armstrong-Jones wasn't yet an earl, not yet royalty adjacent in any formal sense. He was a working photographer, operating out of a studio at 20 Pimlico Road in Chelsea, building a reputation that had already attracted the professional envy of Cecil Beaton. He had photographed the Queen and Prince Philip on their 1957 Canadian tour. He had published a book, London, in 1958. He contributed to Tatler, to the Sunday Times magazine, and to The Queen, a publication whose offices connected him to the second significant figure in this story's social architecture. The Queen was owned by his friend Jocelyn Stevens, born 14th of February 1932 in Marylebone, educated at Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge, and national service in the Rifled Brigade, before inheriting a fortune from the Holton newspaper dynasty. Stevens had bought the magazine in February 1957 as a 25th birthday present to himself. He literally purchased his own birthday gift, which tells you a great deal about how Jocelyn Stevens moved through the world, and had reimagined the title into what social chronicler Nigel Dempster called the Chelsea Sets Bible. He hired Beatrix Miller as editor, Mark Boxer as art director, and Armstrong-Jones as photographer. Stephen's first wife, Jane Sheffield, served as lady-in-waiting to Princess Margaret. The social threads running through all of these lives were dense, doubled, and, when the time came, sufficient for keeping things quiet. Stevens would go on to become chairman of English Heritage, would be knighted in 1996, and would die on 9th October 2014 at the age of 82. His Guardian obituary called him the last of the old-style Fleet Street bosses, reveling in a reputation for brusqueness and bullying. A man, in other words, who wasn't naturally given to disclosure. During the decades between 1960 and his death, in all of his newspaper work and all of his public life, he never spoke publicly about Armstrong-Jones, the Frys, or the question of Polly's parentage. He occupied the outer ring of a circle that ran tight and deep. He kept his position. Armstrong-Jones moved through that same world, operating with multiple identities simultaneously. His entry in the Dictionary of National Biography identifies him as bisexual, a label he never contested during his lifetime. In his 2009 memoir, Redeeming Features, interior designer Nikki Haslam claimed to have conducted an affair with Armstrong-Jones before the marriage to Margaret. Haslam also named Tom Parr, another prominent interior designer, as a former lover. Anne de Courcy's biography, drawn from taped conversations with Armstrong-Jones himself, quotes the assessment of the women who worked at his Pimlico Road studio. To most of the girls who worked there seemed little doubt that Tony was gay. When de Courcy put this to Armstrong-Jones directly, his response was exact and carefully bounded. "I didn't fall in love with boys, but a few men have been in love with me." That distinction between loving and being loved, between initiating and receiving, tells you something about how Armstrong-Jones managed information about himself. He was, according to his biographer, someone for whom work and sex were the two primary motivations, who considered a day without either a day wasted, and whose charm was durable enough that after his divorce from Princess Margaret, her family continued to miss him at Christmas and asked him back. He was someone who had long understood how to be found necessary by people who might otherwise be expected to remove him. The man he was most necessary to, and who was most necessary to him, was Jeremy Fry. Jeremy Joseph Fry was born on the 19th of May, 1924, in Frenchay, near Bristol. His father Cecil was the last chairman of J.S. Fry & Sons, the Quaker chocolate concern established in 1761, inventors of the first molded chocolate bar in 1847, before arranging its sale to Cadbury's, an act that apparently enraged the extended family for years. Jeremy attended Gordonston, trained as an RAF pilot, took a short detour through the Architectural Association under architect Leonard Manasseh, and then pivoted, with what would prove characteristic impatience, towards something more mechanical. He raced 500 cubic centimeter motor cars at Shelsley Walsh hill climbs in 1949 and 1950, posting fastest times in class. He founded Rotork Engineering Company in Bath in 1957 to manufacture electric valve actuators for oil, gas, and water industries, a business that would eventually reach the FTSE 250 index with subsidiaries in 9 countries. By 1960, he was 35, prosperous, and the kind of man about whom no single paragraph is adequate. He would provide £25,000 in seed funding for James Dyson's early vacuum cleaner prototypes, collaborate with Armstrong-Jones on a 4-wheel drive wheelchair with power steering and independent motors for each wheel, purchase the Theatre Royal Bath in 1979 for around £150,000 and oversee its complete restoration. Chair the Northern Ballet Theatre, chair the Arno Fini Gallery in Bristol, and, in his 70s, relocate to Kerala to run coffee plantations before dismantling a Raja's palace and moving it across a mountain range to Tamil Nadu, where he died in July 2005. The Independent's obituary called him a man of astonishing energy and an interest in almost everything. This is understatement of the kind that British newspapers deploy when they aren't sure how to adequately describe someone. He lived with his wife Camilla, née Grinling, at Widcombe Manor, a beautiful 18th century house on the side of a hill above Bath, which they had bought shortly after their 1955 marriage. Widcombe was the kind of house that announces itself with physical confidence. Symmetrical, stone-built, the sort of place that seems to have been waiting for the right occupants, and then relaxes when they arrive. It had lakes, it had outbuildings, it had the Bath Hills behind it, and the sense of being slightly outside the normal rules of English life. Camilla ran a sewing machine in the drawing room and made her own chair covers. Jeremy cleared rushes from the lakes. Small children ran wild in the grounds. And into this picture, every few weekends, came Antony Armstrong-Jones. The Independent's obituary put it plainly. Cecil Beaton and other luminaries would drive 50 miles to tea in the summer to be in the atmosphere of Widcombe Manor. Armstrong-Jones didn't just visit. He used the house as a second base. He brought work there. He brought people there. He brought, eventually, Princess Margaret. And De Courcy's biography states that Jeremy and Camilla had become his closest friends by 1959, and that when she had weekend engagements or he couldn't see her, he often went there by himself. The word himself carries weight in that sentence. De Courcy's biography, published in 2008, describes in precise terms what Armstrong-Jones's life looked like in the summer of 1959, the period during which Polly Fry was conceived. By then, Armstrong-Jones and Princess Margaret were deeply in love and conducting an affair. He was also, the biography notes, still leading his busy private life at full throttle. Girls still came and went at the studio, and although the actress Jackie Chan, his longtime girlfriend, was less in evidence, he was also carrying on an affair with the beautiful actress Gina Ward. The weekends continued, the visits to Bath continued, the Frys' hospitality continued. By the summer of 1959, Camilla Fry was 31 years old, 4 years into her marriage, living in one of the most beautiful private houses in Somerset, and hosting the most socially desirable young photographer in Britain, a man who was, simultaneously, courting a princess, conducting an affair with an actress, and managing an entire network of relationships with the discretion that defined his professional and personal existence. The De Courcy biography also raised, without resolving, the question of the specific nature of the relationship between Armstrong-Jones, Jeremy, and Camilla. The claim, substantiated, according to multiple published accounts, by De Courcy's research, was that the three of them occupied a configuration that went beyond ordinary friendship. The Crown, when it dramatized this story, committed to that interpretation. Published sources are careful about it. What the DNA test established, irrevocably, was the consequence. A letter Camilla wrote to Armstrong-Jones during the later stages of the courtship, preserved in the De Courcy biography, offers a glimpse of how these relationships held together. "Was the second weekend you stayed much easier than the first?" she wrote. "I am sure PM enjoyed it more this time. She seemed so much easier to talk to." That is the voice of someone managing multiple emotional obligations at once. Someone who knew everything, or nearly everything, and had decided that discretion was the mode in which she would operate. When the engagement was announced on February 26, 1960, Camilla was approximately 6.5 months pregnant. The gestational calculation is straightforward. Polly Fry was born on 28 May 1960. A standard pregnancy runs 38 to 40 weeks. Working backward 40 weeks from 28 May 1960 gives approximately 4th August 1959. Working backward 38 weeks gives approximately 18th August. The conception window, by this arithmetic, falls in late July to mid-August 1959. The period during which Armstrong-Jones was regularly at Widcombe Manor, the period De Courcy describes as the height of his busy private life at full throttle. On February 26, 1960, Clarence House announced the engagement of Princess Margaret to Antony Armstrong-Jones. By that date, Camilla Fry was 6.5 months pregnant. Armstrong-Jones's name was publicly linked to a royal wedding. The wedding date was set for 6th of May. On 19th of March, 1960, Buckingham Palace announced that Jeremy Fry would serve as best man. At that point, Camilla was 7 months along. Fry's tenure in the role lasted 21 days. The Sunday newspaper, The People, had assigned reporters to the wedding preparations, and those reporters had found a conviction from 1952, 8 years earlier, when Fry had been charged with importuning for immoral purposes at Marlborough Street Magistrates' Court in London, having approached a man for sex in Hyde Park. He pleaded guilty. His statement to the court was, "I'm afraid I was rather drunk." The court fined him £2. Buckingham Palace's statement on Fry's withdrawal said nothing about any of this. The stated reason was a recurrence of jaundice. Time magazine's coverage, published in the weeks before the wedding, gave both accounts alongside a description of Fry as a longtime bohemian friend of Tony Armstrong-Jones. The use of bohemian in the vocabulary of 1960 was carrying considerable freight. The replacement best man was Dr. Roger William Gilliatt, 37 years old, a friend of 6 years, son of the late surgeon-gynecologist to the Queen. In his Social History, Modernity Britain, David Kynaston notes with characteristic precision that Armstrong-Jones settled on the impeccably heterosexual Roger Gilliatt, a formulation whose dry implications required no elaboration. Not one gossip columnist had guessed Gilliatt's name. He had no history that could embarrass the palace. He stood at the altar on the 6th of May. The day proceeded without incident. What isn't in any contemporary account, what no journalist covering the wedding appears to have known, is that the man whose jaundice had disqualified him from the ceremony was at that moment the named father of a child that his closest friend had fathered on his wife. Armstrong-Jones didn't end the friendship. Whatever proportion of loyalty, guilt, genuine affection, or calculation governed that decision, the relationship continued, not just in private, but in collaborative work. The squirrel wheelchair, the arts patronage, the visits. The friendship that had survived a palace vetting, a public humiliation, and every ordinary reason it should have dissolved, held. The wedding of Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones on the 6th of May, 1960, was, by any measure, an event. Westminster Abbey, Norman Hartnell's white silk organza gown, more than 30 meters of fabric in the full skirt, with the Poltimore tiara made by the House of J.R.R. in the 1870s, and a cathedral-length veil. A bouquet of orchids and lily-of-the-valley. The Duke of Edinburgh gave her away. Her father, George VI, had died in 1952. Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, conducted the ceremony before 2,000 guests, royalty, politicians, film actors, people who had never previously occupied the same room. 8 bridesmaids, including Princess Anne, 9 years old. The register signed. The glass coach processed back to Buckingham Palace through streets lined with crowds who had been there since before dawn. The television broadcast reached an estimated 300 million viewers, the most-watched single event in British history to that date. And then, dinner, the balcony, the fillet of beef and soufflé surprise Montmorency, the departure. They boarded HMY Britannia at Tower Pier as evening settled over London. British Pathé cameras filmed the moment. Armstrong-Jones in morning dress, helping his new wife onto the vessel, the yacht moving away from the pier, passing under the Tower of London, the crowd waving, the Thames opening ahead of them. By April 4th, the ship had already been in dry dock at Portsmouth to receive fresh royal blue paint on her hull. preparations visible in photographs taken that day, showing scaffolding and workmen applying color to the hull. Now she was fully ready. Britannia was 412 feet long, 55 feet in the beam, powered by 2 Pamitrata steam turbines to a top speed of 21.5 knots. She carried 21 officers and 250 royal yachtsmen who wore soft-soled shoes on duty and received orders by hand signal rather than voice to avoid disturbing the royals. She could accommodate 250 guests. Her stateroom interiors were designed to replicate an English country house at sea. Flowered chintz slipcovers, family photographs, rattan settees, and, as the New York Times reported when it boarded her in 1976, the occasional relic of empire. Shark's teeth from the Solomon Islands here, a golden urn commemorating Nelson's victory at Trafalgar there. She was the most private large vessel that the British state had ever built. She was built for exactly this kind of containment. The voyage covered 43 days. They went ashore on Dominica around 21st May, where contemporary photographs record them walking through green terrain, looking precisely as a royal couple on honeymoon were expected to look. They visited Grand Cayman, Mustique, where Colin Tennant's wedding gift of a plot of land was inspected for the first time, the plot that would eventually become one of the defining locations of Margaret's private life. The Bahamas. Other ports whose names appeared in newspapers as dispatches from a royal summer. Armstrong-Jones photographed. Margaret wrote letters. The Britannia moved through warm blue water, and the world, watching the newsreels, watched them look happy. On 28 May 1960, while HMY Britannia was somewhere in the Caribbean on its 22nd day at sea, Polly Fry was born in England. She was registered as the daughter of Jeremy and Camilla Fry. Jeremy gave her his name. Whatever he knew, or had been told, or had arranged to believe in that moment, isn't in the public record. What is documented is that he raised her as his own, that she was part of the life at Widcombe Manor and in the subsequent households Jeremy occupied after the 1967 divorce, and that when his will was read in 2005, he had left her an equal share of what he had built, knowing by then that she wasn't biologically his. She grew up in a world that included Armstrong-Jones, not as an abstraction or a famous name encountered in newspapers, as a presence. The man who photographed the Queen was also the man who had been her father's closest friend since before she was born, who came to Bath, who was part of the texture of Fry family life. His face was familiar. His company, at whatever distance appropriate to a child moving through adult social arrangements, was part of the background. De Courcy's biography describes how Armstrong-Jones conducted himself through the years of the Snowdon marriage. The increasingly public deterioration, the notes left in books listing things he hated about his wife, the affairs on both sides, the drinks and drugs that feature in accounts from people who were in that orbit during the 1960s. Through all of it, including the separation in 1976 and the divorce in 1978 that became the first in the House of Windsor in the 20th century, he maintained his connection to Jeremy Fry. They worked on the Squirrel wheelchair together, a genuine piece of engineering designed to help people with severe mobility impairment navigate terrain that standard wheelchairs couldn't manage. The collaboration was real. Disability advocacy was real for Armstrong-Jones. He had contracted polio at 16, had spent 6 months in the Liverpool Royal Infirmary recovering, and had come away with a permanent limp from his withered left leg. His campaign work contributed to policy changes that affected hundreds of thousands of people. He was, in specific and documented ways, more than the sum of his personal failings. But the Squirrel wheelchair was also built in collaboration with the man who was publicly registered as the father of his biological daughter. Whatever that work meant to both of them, whatever those conversations were, whatever was said and not said, in the workshop and over dinner and across the years, the record doesn't give us. What it gives us is the fact of the collaboration. Two men who knew something that nobody else officially knew, building something useful together, across decades. The doubt, when it arrived for Polly, probably didn't arrive all at once. It rarely does. The experience she describes in published accounts, the accumulating sense of not quite fitting, of looking at photographs and not recognizing the face looking back, is the experience of someone who has spent years conducting a low-level investigation without consciously deciding to. You file things, you notice things, you set them aside because the alternative, at 12 or 17 or 25, is a disruption you don't have the framework to manage. And then you reach a certain point. She later described it to the Telegraph in 11 words. When you reach a certain stage in your life, you just want to know. That isn't an impulsive statement. It's a description of a very long arrival. She was 44 years old. She had been married to Barnaby Higson and had 5 children. She was running an interior design business in London. She was, as she put it in the Daily Mail in 2008, little old me, the person I am today. She had built a life that was entirely hers, which is precisely why the question of its biological coordinates had become bearable to ask. The answer could no longer destroy what she was, because what she was didn't depend on it. She went to Armstrong-Jones, not to Jeremy, to the man she suspected, not the man who had raised her. The test required Armstrong-Jones's participation, and he gave it. The result excluded Jeremy Fry as her biological father and confirmed Armstrong-Jones. The confirmation was clean, the kind of result that doesn't allow for alternative interpretations. Armstrong-Jones then denied the test had happened. He held that position publicly for 4 years, during which time Jeremy Fry, who was 80 years old and living on the other side of the world in Tamil Nadu, called the story utter nonsense. Both men maintained their positions simultaneously. The official story, that there was no story, held together through 2005. Jeremy Fry died on the 18th of July, 2005, aged 81, in his palace in Tamil Nadu. His obituary in The Independent is the portrait of a man who had been, in almost every accessible dimension, extraordinary. The Theatre Royal, the Arnolfini Gallery, the Northern Ballet Theatre, the Rotork valve actuators underwriting global oil and gas infrastructure, the James Dyson seed funding, the Hamlet rebuilt in stone in the Luberon Hills of France. And quietly, almost as an afterword to a life of astonishing manufacture, the decision, in his will, to leave Polly an equal share alongside the children who were biologically his. The man who wasn't her father gave her a portion of everything he had made. He had known, by 2005, for at least a year that she wasn't his biological daughter. He included her anyway. That detail does not resolve the question of what Jeremy Fry knew and when. It doesn't tell us whether there was an arrangement, an understanding, a silence mutually agreed upon between two men who shared a friendship that the public never fully saw into. What it does tell us is that his concept of paternity wasn't reducible to biology. He had raised her. That was the relationship he was acknowledging. Armstrong-Jones admitted the truth approximately in 2008. Anne de Courcy's Snowdon biography, published that year with his cooperation, incorporated the information. The Times reviewer, Valerie Grove, noted it in passing, as though it were simply one more line in a long accounting of a complicated life. Only DNA tests persuaded him to admit to paternity of Jasper Cable Alexander and of Polly Higson, Camilla Fry's daughter, born during his first honeymoon. Born during his first honeymoon. Not after it. Not 9 months after anything. She was born on the 22nd day of a 43-day voyage in England, while her biological father was at sea with Princess Margaret on a royal yacht surrounded by 271 crew. Somewhere in this story, in the gap between what was privately known and what was publicly stated, there are three men whose silence shaped the next 60 years. Not three possible fathers. The DNA resolved that. Three men who each held a different piece of a truth that none of them chose to name. The first was Antony Armstrong-Jones himself, who knew by the arithmetic of dates, if not by any direct conversation, that Polly might be his, who received the DNA result in 2004, who denied it publicly for 4 years, who subsequently acknowledged it privately to Polly, who invited her, according to reporting after his death, to address him as Pops, and then signed a will in 2006, 2 years after receiving the result, that allocated his estate among 4 other children and excluded her entirely. The second was Jeremy Fry, who raised a child he knew, or came to know, wasn't biologically his, who denied the story publicly until his death, and who then left her an equal share of his estate in the one final document where he could speak without anyone being able to stop him. The third was the wider circle, Jocelyn Stevens, who knew them all and said nothing. The friends, collaborators, and social satellites of the Fry-Armstrong-Jones world in the 1950s and 1960s who watched a complex arrangement hold together across decades and said nothing. And the palace itself, which responded to the 2004 DNA story with its standard instrument, silence that implies nothing, denies nothing, acknowledges nothing, and thereby confirms the existing record unchanged. Each of these silences worked differently. Armstrong-Jones's silence was self-protective. Jeremy Fry's silence was, the will suggests, something more complicated than self-protection. The palace's silence was institutional. It has no mechanism for acknowledging the private lives of those who married into the family and subsequently divorced from it. And the social circle's silence was simply the operating condition of a world where discretion was the price of membership. What connects all three is that none of them told Polly. Not a single one of the adults who knew, who attended the wedding in May 1960, who received the news of the birth 3 weeks later, who continued to move in and out of each other's lives for decades, who sat at dinners and attended openings and collaborated on wheelchairs and ran arts institutions alongside each other. None of them decided that the child herself deserved to know. Armstrong-Jones died on January 13, 2017, at his home in Kensington, aged 86. His estate was valued at £3.2 million. His will had been signed in 2006, 2 years after receiving the DNA result, while still publicly denying the test had taken place. The document divided his estate among 4 of his 5 children: David and Sarah, his children with Princess Margaret; Lady Frances, his daughter with his second wife, Lucy Lindsay Hogg; and Jasper Cable Alexander, his son from a 1998 affair with a Country Life magazine editor. For Polly, nothing. The Times, having obtained the will after his death, reported it plainly. Lord Snowdon left a secret love child born while he and Princess Margaret were on their honeymoon out of his £3.2 million will. He had invited her, in private, to call him Pops. He had acknowledged the relationship between them, quietly, in the small space of what the two of them knew together. And then he wrote a legal document that said she didn't exist. The private acknowledgement and the public erasure coexisted in the same man simultaneously, which is perhaps the most precise thing that can be said about how Antony Armstrong-Jones managed relationships throughout his life. Polly attended his funeral. She had already set down her account of what she had learned. In 2008, 4 years after the DNA result and 3 years after Jeremy Fry's death, She wrote in the Daily Mail with the specific clarity of someone who has processed something long enough to have reached the far side of it. Finding out at the age of 45 that the man I had idolized and put on a pedestal higher than Nelson's column since I was a small child wasn't, in fact, my father, was a hard burden to bear. Rather than being twisted with guilt and shame at what I've done in uncovering a secret that I should have been told long ago, I can just carry on being little old me, the person I am today. The man on the pedestal was Jeremy, not Armstrong-Jones. Jeremy Fry, with his blinding green eyes, his astonishing energy, his theater and his gallery, and his valve actuators, and his wheelchair, and his palace in Tamil Nadu. The man who had given her his name, and his equal inheritance, and whatever version of a father he had in him to give. The discovery that Armstrong-Jones was her biological father didn't elevate Armstrong-Jones. It complicated Jeremy. And she resolved that complication by holding both things at once. The man who raised her was still the man who raised her, regardless of the chromosome count. That isn't a passive resolution. It requires work. It requires a decision about which facts count. She made that decision, said what she had to say, and kept being the person she already was. Princess Margaret had died in February 2002, before the DNA story broke. Jocelyn Stevens died in October 2014. Armstrong-Jones died in January 2017. Jeremy Fry died in July 2005. Every adult who was in the room, or in the social universe, in 1960, when the birth was registered and the honeymoon was underway, and the official story was being constituted by the simple fact of no one saying anything to the contrary, is gone. The palace never responded to the 2004 disclosure. It didn't respond in 2008 when Armstrong-Jones admitted it was true. It didn't respond when the will's exclusion of Polly became public knowledge after his death. The institution has no mechanism for retrospective acknowledgement of this kind, and no incentive to create one. The official record of the 1960 honeymoon remains as it was: a 43-day Caribbean cruise, departure, Tower Pier, 6th May. Return, Portsmouth, 21st June. Both parties tanned and smiling in the newsreel. That record describes a voyage. It records the Britannia being painted royal blue in dry dock at Portsmouth on 4th April 1960. It records the footage of the yacht passing under the Tower of London with the new Earl of Snowdon and his royal wife aboard. It records the stops at Dominica and Grand Cayman and Mustique. It does not record what Armstrong-Jones knew on 28 May 1960, on whatever latitude Britannia had reached by then, when a baby was being born in England under his closest friend's name. It does not record what it felt like to be at sea, whether the knowledge arrived as guilt or as relief at the distance, whether the Caribbean water looked any different on that day, whether it registered at all. Polly Fry is in her mid-60s now. She runs an interior design business in London. She has 5 children. She asked her question at 44, got her answer, said what she had to say, and kept working. The DNA test is the hard fact. It always was. The birth date of 28th May 1960. The wedding date of 6th May 1960. The honeymoon departure of 6th May 1960. The return date of 21st June 1960. All documented. The will is public record. The biology is settled. What remains unsettled is the only question that can't be answered by a laboratory. Not who the father was, but why not one of the adults who knew, across 44 years and 2 generations, found the occasion to say so to the person it concerned most. The official record of the 1960 honeymoon still lists no irregularities. It never will. Subscribe for more stories like this.